we've got a really interesting interview with Alexander Rose, who's the executive director of the Long Now Foundation. And this project that we want to talk to you about is what you call the Manual of Civilization, and all these books behind you. Why don't you give a little context of that project and kind of the roots of it, or why you started doing it, and what became of it?
Yeah, so the place I'm sitting is the headquarters for Long Now, but it's also a bar, a cafe, a library, and an event space called The Interval here in San Francisco that we created as part of our headquarters. And one of the main elements that we wanted to build into this space was a library. And being the Long Now Foundation, kind of paying attention on civilization level scales, we had a limited amount of space, let's say about 3,000 to 3,500 volumes. So we couldn't be a massive library, but our question became what is our cut across culture that we are going to use to collect books? And after talking with Kevin Kelly and Brewster Kahle from the Internet Archive and the Prelingers of the Prelinger Archive, we came up with this collection principle that we called the Manual for Civilization. And the idea was to collect the 3,000 or so books you would most want to restart or sustain civilization. And in order to not get cornered into one type of book, we selected 4 categories. One is basically the literary canon, so the humanities. That's everything from Aeschylus to Shakespeare, all the classics. The next one is the past and the future, so history and futurism, the way we think about both the past and the future. The other one is science fiction, which a lot of it is actually behind me now. I'm sitting in front of that section. And the last section is the mechanics of civilization. That's everything from how to deliver a baby to how to cook to how to make steel and remake the machine tool world that we live in now.
If civilization should collapse, how would this actually be kind of about as good a start as you could get? Or was it just something that, boy, as we get more and more sophisticated, wouldn't it be nice we got to preserve these old texts that are kind of useful to our cultural heritage or something? Or both, I don't know. Give us some motivation.
Right, well, we're not predicting that civilization's going to collapse, but this just became a really interesting collection principle, and almost a kind of a litmus test that when you ask somebody what are the most important books that you think should be preserved, and you get a very interesting division that starts happening when you ask that question, and we asked it among our thousands of members to both help us suggest books as well as help us edit the books, and then we also asked a bunch of notable people from our board as well as other authors and historians and experts in certain areas to help us collect around certain things, but the real notion, like I said, it's both to restart civilization as well as to sustain civilization. So you can kind of look at it however you want. It could either be apocalyptic, or it could be these are the books you would most want if you got dropped off on a desert island or landed on Mars. What collection of books would you want? And in our opinion, the collection should be highly living, and that we should, we're going to fill these shelves up. We're about halfway there now. We have about 1,500 books towards our 3,000. And then once we fill all the shelves, we will probably have events here where people can suggest new books, but then they also have to suggest which book they're going to take off, and then people can argue the merits of one book versus the other in the collection.
Did they tend to suggest more books that tended to be more kind of how to rebuild civilization, the kind of that 4th category, the one that's more the engineering piece, or did they actually migrate in any particular direction? It'd be interesting to know.
I would say it varies a fair amount, but actually most of our founders, people like Stuart Brand, Kevin Kelly, well, Kevin Kelly probably, the former editor of Wired, went more in the technical, actually how-to thing. Interestingly, Stuart Brand, who was the editor at the Whole Earth Catalog, I was expecting to get a lot of how-to type things, and he went much more into decline and fall of the Roman Empire kind of texts, and thought those were more important.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Stuart's thing, because that's an interesting one. And you work super closely with him and get his brain. What do you think he was thinking about, or could we talk a little bit more about the kinds of things on his list, and what do you think he was thinking for that reason? Why did he choose that?
So some of these lists were created where someone sat down and just started thinking about books. Some of them were me walking through their own personal libraries. And in the case of Stuart, I walked through his personal library with him, and he just started pulling spines, and I started writing down titles. So, if you look at some of Stuart's books, he's got Herodotus, Thucydides, but he's also got things like The History of the World in 100 Objects. Then it goes to the Odyssey, a book about dirt and how valuable that is to civilizations and how we're losing it on a and that's kind of a fundamental civilizational responsibility is to not ruin our own soil. So it runs the whole gamut of the deepest into the humanities and great books to don't forget we need soil to grow plants.
We'll be sure to post, by the way, this list, which to those that are watching this, they'll certainly get it right here on the website. But it's also interesting, a lot of science fiction, which is an interesting genre that, it is literature, it's the humanities at some level, but it's also rooted in tech. Well, talk about that science fiction category a little bit, whether it's through the lens of Stuart or the others that have been contributing to that category.
Yeah, it was. I felt as though it was really important to have science fiction in the thing that we're calling the Manual for Civilization, because I feel as though it's kind of the play space of how we're going to create our world. And so we don't select any science fiction. Fantasy doesn't really make it into this so much. Dragons and things like that are not really going to be, I think, very helpful about the way we think about the future. But I do think that when you look at something like Ian Banks or Frank Herbert with Dune, some of these books are just they are such rigorous world-building exercises where in some cases they take certain technologies to an extreme. Let's say Dune, for instance, was one of the most recommended books we've had across the board. Stuart recommended it. Pretty much everyone recommended it. And you can imagine in a world of climate change that the idea of a dune world, as well as resource scarcity, in the case of Dune, spice, but it's highly illustrative. It also talks about the technology of adaptation for all of these things, civilization, the way the civilization kind of reorients itself around the scarcity of either water or spice in this case. So I think they're where we learn about how our futures might be. There are scenario building exercise, if you will, of the future.